17, which turns out to be a text by Eric Laurent that goes by the title, The Society of the Symptom. So the title itself is Eric Laurent's title. This is a text that I found on the website of the AMP, the World Association of Psychoanalysis, where it's available in French and Spanish versions, but there is, as far as I can find out, no English version. What I'm going to be running you through today, shall we say, is a rather improvised running translation into English of what is actually quite an intriguing and useful text, which is unattributed in the version that I've managed to get hold of, even including so it's of uncertain date, but I suspect it falls between Laurent's 98 text on the symptom and the proper name, which you will find in both psychoanalytic notebooks 15 on the names of the father, and then repeated again in the special issue number 30 as the final text selected for the notebooks 30. This extended text from Eric Laurent's 97-98 course under the name The Symptom and the Proper Name. And why I'm just mentioning this, because we can then see it almost, this current text on the Society of the Symptom, as the intermediate step between that earlier business on the symptom and the proper name towards the more recent politics of the Symptom and the body event that we've seen elaborated in Laurent's text on the inverse of biopolitics, which to some extent makes a perfect complement to the Lacanian text on the inverse of psychoanalysis, even though it takes the argument a bit further around the notion of the Joycean Symptom. So it seemed to me that this, let's call it intermediate paper, turns out to be quite well aligned with Seminar 17, even to the extent that it actually seems to be extracted to some extent from a reading of Radiophonie, bringing back into focus the degree to which actually Radiophonie, which again we don't have in any kind of reliable English translation, is the most reliable commentary we have on Seminar 17, because it's Lacan's own formulation, written écrit, on what's at stake for him in Seminar 17. And sometimes we're so busy, let's say, wrestling with Seminar 17, we don't have time to go and look at Radiophonie to see how he formulates the stake of that year's work for himself. Taking what I can out of the Laurent text in following it, he starts by formulating the notion under this idea of the society of the symptom. He starts by formulating the notion of the symptom in civilization as the Lacanian version, the Lacanian translation of the Freudian discontents of civilization. So he translating the Freudian notion of the discontents of civilization into the Lacanian notion of the symptom in civilization. To some extent, that's the trajectory of the argument. In both cases, indexed on the matheme, little a over the I of the ideal. Why this matheme highlighted by Miller, which is to some extent at stake in Miller's 2004 paper on the fantasy, where he aligns the discourse of the analyst with the discourse of the civilization at a subsequent stage, is that absolutely reduced matheme of little a over I turns out to mark the conjunction at stake, in which the object little a comes to dominate the capital I of the ideal, which to some extent translates the decline of the ideal on one hand, accompanied by the exigencies of jouissance, a push to jouissance without limit on the other hand, indexed on the object A. This matheme, A over I, is in itself, to some extent, an absolutely reduced formula for the Freudian trajectory that would, describing the discontents of civilization as manifested, which would take us from Freud's 1908 text on it's called Civilized Sexual Morality and Modern Nervous Illness. So there's Freud's first topography version of civilization and its discontents, which is then revisited after Beyond the Pleasure Principle and Inhibition, Symptoms and Anxiety in Civilization and its Discontents, which is a revisiting of the themes but with the Mebian twist of the second topology. This trajectory that matheme allows us to isolate in let's say, that aspect of the Freudian trajectory is what is summed up in Lacan's phrase, the ascent of object A to the social zenith, a formulation precisely that can be found in his text Radiophonie, given in the same year as Seminar 17. As Laurent points out, speaking of the ascent of the object A to the social zenith implies that this is a process that didn't commence recently. The zenith is the highest point of a trajectory. So although the matheme encapsulates it in a structural formula, Laurent to some extent sets out to trace the trajectories that's at stake in the notion of ascent to the apex of a trajectory, the ascent of the object A to the zenith of the social, the high point of the social. This effect being marked in particular by the effect of anxiety produced or as the index of the emergence of the object A in civilization. So we can take the effect of anxiety as the index of the emergence of the object A. In this intriguing text, Laurent then traces the process of the emergence of the object A in the place of the ideal in the course, let's say, of 20th century civilization following the end of the First World War. So taking it's an abbreviated trajectory, but it's one example of what can be done in applying the reading from the theory to the reading of our times. So following what was characterized as the collective suicide of European civilization in the First World War, the breakdown of any conception of the integrity of European civilization, marked, for instance, by the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire following the war. What emerges is some kind of sentiment of the vanity of civilization that was then dispersed into the intellectual field of ideas. Laurent traces various traces of this effect as deployed in the intellectual sphere. I'll just mention two of them. One of them is the influence on Heidegger's conception of the man of care, which is not, we have difficulty in translating that notion of sorge. It's not in the modern sense of caregivers, but rather it's the man of concern, of preoccupation. So indexing the conception of the man of preoccupation around the emergence of the object A, which Heidegger characterizes as pivotal to the status of modern subjectivity, and speaks, in Being and Time, speaks about the place of anxiety in the following terms, which is my translation of the Spanish of the German, which is that before which anxiety anguishes is in fact being in the world. So being in the world indexed on a confrontation with anxiety. I'm not much of a Heideggerian, so you don't have to follow my translation, but you can go and look to that if you want to. Which the emergence of anxiety as a trace of object A in Heidegger's work as the modern philosopher of Dasein. Being and Time, published in 1927, at exactly the time that Freud is then elaborating civilization and its discontents. where Freud speaks about the unconscious feeling of guilt engendered by civilization itself, and proposes that this unconscious feeling of guilt engendered by civilization is a topological equivalent of that same anxiety that Heidegger speaks about. The quote from chapter 7 of Civilization and Its Discontents. This is in the Revere translation. At bottom, the sense of guilt is nothing but a topographical variant of anxiety. In its later phases, it coincides completely with the dread of the superego. Behind that dread is the anxiety, the anguish of the superego. The sense of guilt produced by civilization is not perceived as such. It remains to a great extent unconscious and only comes to expression as a sort of uneasiness or discontent for which other motivations are sought. So we can trace parallel effects, let's say, in Heidegger and in Freud, coming to grips with the emergence of a new form of unease, which Freud encapsulates in this notion of the discontents of civilization. We can then move on, as a sketching of it, we can then move on to the question of the treatment of this emerging anxiety at the level of civilization, which can be pursued, again in reduced form, in terms of relations between little a and the I of the ideal, or more generally between little a and the big A of the other. To some extent, that's condensed matheme of the relation between little a and I marks the correlation, shall we say, between the emergence of the little a in its anxiogenic effects and the decline of the other. So in that minimal articulation, we have the decline of the symbolic and the emergence of an unframed anxiety. Although, with those two terms, we can ask, it's not so much cause and effect. Is it the decline of the other that causes the emergence of anxiety? Or is it the emergence of anxiety that causes the decline of the other? Or do we need a third term that helps us to understand the correlation of that articulation? Pursuing some of these questions, not in the clinical theory, but at a broader reading of effects in civilization. Laurent just briefly tracks the space between the two world wars, following the First World War, before the outbreak of the Second World War, in terms of the dream of the restoration of some whole. So, on the one hand, following the First World War, the total breakdown of civilization, any unitary sense of what Western civilization would be, replaced by a dream of the restoration of this lost whole, this lost sense of unity and place in the world, which in the end very quickly takes the form of the dream of the totalitarian state. So on the one hand, the invocation or the seduction of the charismatic leaders of the totalitarian parties, but on the other hand, the promise that it would restore some kind of nostalgic whole, where the nostalgia for the lost universe of civilization very quickly culminated in the horrors of the camps and the Second World War. It's an absolutely reduced reading of a trajectory, but quite a powerful, let's say, indication for us. Following the Second World War, Laurent again highlights the parallel emergence of two new forms of treatment for anxiety. Forms of what he characterizes as attempts to grasp onto new master signifiers that had emerged from the rubble of the Second World War. One of these, on the one hand, he identifies the vogue of Sartrean existentialism, with at the roots of the notion of an existential therapy for anxiety. But at the same time, he highlights the links of the existential philosophers to their adherence to the Communist Party in the 50s. So with the idea that the existential philosophers were all either adherents or fellow travelers of the Communist Party and the dreams and signifiers that the Communist Party offered. So it's quite intriguing, because now he's going to contrast the second strand which is the rise of the fundamentalists of the free market during the 40s and the 50s. The believers precisely in the invisible hand of the market, most of all like Hayek, the fundamentalists of the free market, virulently opposed to any kind of central state planning of the Soviet kind, the blind faith in the virtues of the free market and the invisible hand. Hayek, who was Margaret Thatcher's one go-to political philosopher justification. So it's at exactly that point that we see the free market taking over the place of the other as providing answers to the questions of government, the site of articulation of the choices of each one with those of all, as we mentioned earlier in the discussion. So it's at that stage, almost in the disarray of governmental political solutions in the aftermath of the war, we have the rise of the market as the new other that gives responses to questions of the articulation of the one and the all. Laurent also makes room for a third strand during the 1950s, which is what he terms the rise of the scientism, the belief in science during the 1950s. The hope in the prospects opened up by the new technological advances. On the one hand, the launch of the military-industrial complex, the development of the atomic bomb itself seen as a triumph for Western civilization over the forces of darkness, with all the paradoxes that emerge, shall we say, at stake in the anxiety of the scientists themselves about the unleashing of new technological resources that turn out to be absolutely in the service of the death drive, and the consequences of the possible destruction of human civilization, shall we say, on a global scale. So those three strands, and as an absolutely reduced reading, it's quite intriguing. The strand of existentialism as the treatment of anxiety, backed up by a faith in Soviet communism, the alternative of belief in the other of the market, the free market and the invisible hand to solve everything for everyone, and for government most of all. And the third strand, let's say the new scientific faith, which doesn't outrun the anxiety provoked by the very developments that the scientists themselves are producing. Almost in the braid of those three different strands traced through the 50s, Laurent locates Lacan's critique more clearly during the 60s of the rise of a new master signifier, the notion of the common market, which to some extent is the master signifier, the hybrid of the dream according to which the sphere of the market would replace politics as the sphere for working out political questions, supported by the growth of the new technocratic bureaucracy of European administration, presented as some kind of sketch for a new universal state, which, as you see, are questions still absolutely live for the question of the fate, shall we say, of Europe today, which to some extent concerns our own. So we could track, most of all during the 1960s, Lacan's critique of this notion of the common market. For instance, in the closing discourse of the study days of infantile psychosis from 1967, which I know is translated somewhere, maybe in Hurly-Burly, but offhand I couldn't track it down, but effectively entails a critique of the belief in the unlimited expansion of the universal, seen at the level of the unification of common markets in Europe, but also in the form of new political groupings, which in effect delegate the ideas of economic union to the technological administrators who would provide the administrative platform to make that possible, to some extent eliding the political sphere. Maybe the main point to extract from that is the reliance on the logic of the universal, the logic of the for all, most obviously delivered or promised by science, as a substitute for, let's say, the for all of democracy. But in each instance, again, as we mentioned before, the logic of the for all is to ignore, in the strong sense of not want to know, the question of the return of jouissance that manifests itself in the corollary tendency to segregation. And that's exactly what Lacan is flagging up at each stage of that, from the 1963 address on child psychosis. The factor at stake here is the most burning issue of our times, insofar as this era is the first to have undergone the calling into question of every social structure as a result of the progress of science. So, again, following that articulation of the ideal and the little a, on the one hand, we have the idea of an enhanced push to the for all of the universal in the scientific, the economic, and the political spheres, which unfortunately entail effects of foreclosure of the particularity of jouissance that's not encapsulated in the universal, that doesn't answer to the for all of the universal signifier, but rather returns in the real in the form of an ever aggravated push towards the jouissance of segregation. It just occurs to me on the basis just of our chat earlier, Alistair, that somewhere there it's almost a mapping of the argument about the Marxian notion of surplus value. Because at the start of this text, the part of the text that was too difficult for me to untangle, Laurent speaks about the foreclosure of surplus value in the capitalist market. That it's to some extent, surplus value is systematically foreclosed in the trade between use value and exchange value. There's this shadow of surplus value, which is impossible to calculate or to attribute. The one thing we know is it can't be put back. There's the question of who appropriates the surplus value that's freed up in the articulation between exchange value and use value. But the notion that surplus value is foreclosed from the capitalist system, it opens up an intriguing way of pursuing this way. Precisely at the point where it then re-encounters this version of the universal logic of the master signifiers of the market and the foreclosure of the effects of particularity of jouissance that do not answer to the for all of the universal signifier of the market, but rather returns in the real in the form of the ever aggravated push towards the jouissance of segregation. So actually segregation and surplus jouissance are articulated in the same mechanism. There's work to be done there to clarify what's at stake there, including the mapping of the two versions of surplus value and segregation in the capitalist discourse. That's not exactly where we're going to get to because Laurent pursues that articulation with a section entitled Identificatory Chaos and Overdose, which again are distributed on the two sides of the binary of that articulation. So he indexes the crisis of 1968 in France and Europe more generally as a crisis of master signifiers, as a crisis of identifications, a crisis that demonstrated that the current master signifiers were outmoded and ineffective, no longer effective in organizing, capturing, and distributing jouissance. He also suggests that the very shift in Lacan's teaching to the later teaching was inflected by this crisis, and that the emergence of the logical form of the not all was itself an attempt to get to grips with the decline of the power of the unitary master signifiers previously operative. Thus, we could say that one of the things that the crisis of 68 demonstrated was that it showed civilization to be untotalizable. Laurent quotes this from Millet's paper on the tomb of the man of the left. So civilization was shown to be as fragmented, dispersed, and inconsistent multiplicity, in other words, not all, which is something that affects the status of the other as well as the status of the civilization in its role as other. So we're setting up the discourse of civilization as the discourse of the other, trying to locate, let's say, mutations in the discourse of civilization aligned with changes in the modality of subjective symptoms in those discourses. So we have on the one side the inconsistency of the other, the fragmentation of any dream of a unitary framework of civilization. One of the paradoxical consequences of the move towards globalization. So in the shift from the era of common markets, unified national markets, to that of a global market, it's not simply one more progression. Because one of the consequences of the shift to the notion of a global market is that what is brought to light by the failure of any kind of unitary master signifiers that would organize the global market is the untotalizable or non-unitary character of what we had previously called civilization. He gives quite a striking formulation for this effect, which in simple translation reads, "It turns out that the current state of civilization is perfectly compatible with chaos." It's a very powerful formulation because one has to get one's head around actually what that means for our dreams of order. So let's say one of the internal effects of this contemporary chaos is correlated with the absence of any defining limits of what would be our civilization. To some extent, the shift to globalization entails the interpermeability of civilizations. The consequence is neither one unitary global civilization, nor in fact multiple civilizations, but rather a melting pot without any form of recognizable master signifiers to organize it as civilization. Therefore, in principle, civilization becomes indistinguishable from chaos. There's the chaos theory of civilization for you. So it turns out that civilization, or what we tend to think of as civilization, when it turns out we don't even know any longer what civilization would be, what constitutes civilization? Civilization without borders. So we could say that maybe one primary discontent of contemporary civilization is the failure of civilization itself, the failure of the constitution of anything that would pass as civilization. So not so much, shall we say, as the war of civilizations, as the right would have it, nor even as some kind of conflict between civilization and barbarianism, as the other version would have it, but civilization and barbarianism become indistinguishable because they're absolutely impenetrable, because there's no constituted civilization that we would recognize. Hence, the consequences for our thinking about this binary, shall we say, in Freudian terms of civilization and its discontents. And we could say it's this reworking that underlies the shift in Laurent's title towards the notion of a society of the symptom, because civilization and its discontents no longer operate on either side of the binary. So, in terms of trying to trace out the consequences of some of these rather rapid developments, one would be the realization that civilization by no means needs to be harmonious. It does not have to constitute any kind of harmonious whole, nor does it even necessarily have to aspire to one. Hence the notion of civilization as chaos, or a civilization of chaos, because let's put it this way, chaos turns out to be far more profitable than civilization. Here, Laurent speaks to, refers to a book at the time by under the title Empire of Chaos by a French writer whose name I don't even know how to pronounce, Alain Joxe, Joxe. How would the French speakers pronounce that? Anyway, the book called Empire of Chaos, which is probably not available in an English translation anywhere near you. But this book speaks of a system of unlimited virtual conquest, creating a space of domination that is never consolidated and never pacifying. So it's the very opposite of the notion of the market as the beneficial other. And rather, we have a version that opens up, shall we say, onto the ferocity of the new right, where there's a completely different logic and dynamic, where on the one hand, he mentions, shall we say, as a step, a dynamic between centralization and extension in the global market, by which the empire of capital manages to outrun or to exceed any control or stability that it itself claims to install. It's a version, let's say, of surplus value run riot, where there's an installation, shall we say, of multiple and transitory master signifiers of the market, but not in the interest of any kind of unity or stabilization. But on the contrary, it turns out that the provocation of chaos is far more useful for the extraction of surplus value. You see why it's people like Farage and Rees-Mogg, the hedge funders of the right, who are quite happy to take, it's not simply to provoke the chaos that Brexit would bring, because it's good for business. The political stuff is just a sideline, because in the meantime their hedge fund is because money can be made from markets that go down as well as up. So what we have, in a way, we've already seen it in the States and to some extent under Thatcher here, the chaos of deregulation. And the quote here is, "The chaos that proceeds from deregulation to which societies are submitted, societies which not all that long ago were part of the world order, or at least some kind of local order. But what is at stake now is not so much how to achieve stability, but rather which form of chaos is likely to be more profitable." And it's not these reading that we tend to find on the surface of events. It's the far-right conspiracy theory who've seen very clearly where their own profit is to be made, and in a funny way, damn the collateral damage. Yeah. What occurs to me is almost the image of the locust plague of global capitalism passing through any zone for the extraction of whatever surplus value is available, disrupting all the traditional master signifiers and any stable orders, and leaving a trail of destruction and chaos in its wake as it moves on to the next feeding ground. This all at stake, shall we say, in the shift from the era of common markets to that of globalization, as if it was just one more step along the same logic. So in place of what Lacan in the 50s speaks about as our future as common markets, we have systematic and chronic precarity and uncertainty that accompanies the globalized market, where in effect there's no place to hide. I'm going to spare you that, except to see that what's at stake, going back to our core math theme between the A and the I, is a different dynamic between the erection of master signifiers and the extraction of surplus value. So although the same terms operate the articulation functions according to a different logic. So in one phase, we could say, in one phase of capitalism, modern capitalism, markets replace government as the source of stability and articulation between divergent social factors. But overthrowing traditional forms of governmental legitimacy as they do so, the market moves into the sphere of government. But in the phase of global capitalism, markets themselves are no longer organized around identifiable master signifiers. Hence the financial crisis, the loss of the credit crisis, the loss of credibility of the regulators, the auditors, the central banks, the governor generals, leaves us, as Laurent says, with markets in search of new master signifiers that would leave the markets themselves legible. So if one element has characterized, shall we say, the past decade of economics, is the illegibility of the markets. And any kind of unitary master signifier that might have provided legibility for economic has gone, which can be tied on one hand to the role of the master signifier precisely in its role as the principle of legibility in the clinic as much as in the market. To the extent that it's the master signifier, or at least the name of the father, that guarantees the conjunction between signifier and signified to produce recognizable meaning. To some extent, that's the role of the master signifier as the formalization of the name of the father is to guarantee the link between signifier and signified, and therefore the extraction of signification and meaning. But what we have now is the converse process of the insertion of the signifier as a principle of disruption, which in a funny way, the signifier designed to provoke effects of disruptive jouissance in the social body, the fragmentation of all previous modes of organization in the interest precisely of the extraction or the production of surplus from that very effect of disarray. We see that, shall we say, tracked in the clinic of the Symptom and the body event, where the impact of the signifier, it's in radiophony itself, that separation, significantization and corporization, where it's the effect of the signifier on the body that separates out, shall we say, the jouissance of the other from the extraction of surplus jouissance, out of that very split. So here we could track the development in Lacan's work, which pivots on Seminar 17, with the notion in the first place that signifier and signified are not intrinsically associated. In the first instance, they require the framework of the paternal metaphor, the agency of the name of the father, to install the principle of legibility and intelligibility. Second step, speaking broadly, with the pluralization of the names of the father, the other of language and discourse is called on to guarantee any kind of systematic coherence of discourse. Hence, to some extent, the introduction of the notion of the master signifier itself, at the same time as the introduction of the notion of discourse in Seminar 17, we tend to blur these things together as if they've always been there. But actually, it's the introduction of discourse and the introduction of the master signifier that are two versions of the reworking, shall we say, of the Schwarzerian model of signifier and signified. So it's in the place of the name of the father that would guarantee the point de capitan between signifier and signified. Instead, we have the systematic elaboration of the discourses themselves. On the one hand, the master signifier as a formalized reduction of the name of the father in its plurality. On the other hand, the framework of the discourses themselves operating that function as framing of anxiety, constructing a principle of the social bond, in an era that no longer supposes any all or any whole of signification. If you'll allow, there's then a third step, which is worth getting into focus, which is the notion of the signifier as cause of jouissance. Colin earlier spoke about that formulation extracted from Seminar 7 as about the word as the murder of the thing. Well, when we set alongside the formulation the word as the murder of the thing, the later formulation of the signifier as cause of jouissance, we have some idea of the reconfiguration of the coordinates of the entire theory, of the entire teaching, because it's the very converse. From the signifier as the negation of jouissance, now we have the signifier as the cause and provocation of jouissance. Funny enough, that passes, whether that's formulated in Seminar 20, funny enough, that passes via Seminar 17, where that chapter of knowledge as a means of jouissance. Because the moment we get knowledge into the frame as a means of jouissance, we're only one step away from the signifier as the cause of jouissance, which is absolutely the overthrow. That's the other side of the formulation of the word as the murder of the thing. There's a little more of this if you're interested in following, whether you need a breather. I'm going fast because there's a lot of it to track. And it's stuff that to some extent we know some of the pieces, but it's quite novel to me to actually see it lined up. And it's not even clear that we would have gone down this path if it wasn't for Colin's proposal to take up Seminar 17. This is all, so far, shall we say, my running translation of the first 3 pages of the Spanish, so any errors of translation and misinterpretation will be on my side. It may be that Eric Laurent's argument is actually more profound and more organized than that.
Is there a date on his paper?
That's part of the irony, so it's very difficult to locate it, but I suspect it's from the early 2000s. The Society of the Symptom, available in French or in Spanish off the AMP website, unless someone is going to translate it in the meantime. So, having paused for a breath at that point, let's return to the index effect of anxiety associated with the emergence of object A to the zenith of the social. Because it turns out that anxiety and the object A then provides the compass, the core reference, around which we can track the push towards the reconstitution of some kind of viable whole within which that object could be framed. But in a context in which there is no longer any belief in the other, nor in the signifier of the name of the Father, whether as the index of the coherence of discourse, or as the unitary signifier of the trace of jouissance. So Laurent poses the challenge, shall we say, of this new configuration in the following terms. The effort to reconstitute an other as all is based on the unbearable absence of any guarantee of jouissance. At the social level, we don't have to understand each step, as I say, the garbled translations, but to try to track some of the coordinates of the movement. In relation to this notion, emergence of object A, overthrowing the coherent frame of the ideal, production of effects of anxiety associated with the emergence of object A, and the decline of any kind of unitary other, to the extent the decline of the symbolic and the decline of belief in the other per se. We thus witness at the social and political level a double movement. On the one hand, the rise of populist assemblies, which in themselves attempt to reconstitute some kind of all, in this instance based on the exclusion of some. So there we have, to some extent, the logic of segregation at stake in the rise of populism, because it would be all of us together except them, where actually, to some extent, the exclusion of them is the condition for the integrity of us. On the other hand, this is the line of overdose. Laurent formulates attempts to access jouissance, shall we say, via a shortcut. And he uses the term contemporary paganism, which we can use this notion of contemporary paganism as an index of the decline in the monotheism, the belief in the one God, to some extent the monotheism of civilization itself, where the contemporary pagan, which to some extent is the contemporary subject, seeks out proof of the existence of a God in the experience of overdose. it's a fantastic argument. Even though it's a shorthand, it's something that can be expanded. So he speaks about the notion of ecstasis in the history of civilization as always being, to some extent, an experience of the ecstasis of jouissance, all the way back to the mystics and always as an opportunity to verify the existence of the dimension of something other, whether it's in the presence of the one God of monotheism, belief in the God of all, or in the myth and practice of the Bacchanalia of Dionysus, the religion of ecstasy. For the modern subject, it's paradoxical, but it's absolutely robust, shall we say. The existence of God is manifested in the overdose. Because it's in the presence within himself of this effect of ecstasis that the subject experiences the presence of another or an other dimension. And therefore he believes in it. So to some extent we have the construction of a new belief in an other based on an experience of jouissance, which to some extent is a reduced formula not just for the new religion, but also for the new politics, where it's no longer belief in the other as the framing of jouissance, but the event of jouissance as the foundation for some kind of other that I can believe in. In a funny way, an inversion of the traditional Freudian model of the articulation between other and jouissance. And to some extent different to the paranoid solution, which would identify jouissance in the place of the other. So instead we have the generalized overdose. And then alongside that we can track various manifestations of what Laurent calls the search for the presence of an other in us, in all extreme sports, searching out of the death drive. Indexed on the one hand on that question, oh God, why have you abandoned us? The abandonment of the other, deaths of despair. And on the other hand, manifestations of the drive, of the death drive. To some extent, the death drive pushing towards the terminal jouissance of extinction, which to some extent we see manifestations of that all around us. I'm going to spare that. We could track that out. I'll try to get to the end of the framework of the argument, and then we can fill in the reading of the details. So Laurent again says, we know with Lacan, following the second typology of Freud, that the subject prefers its jouissance to its self-preservation, the rat in the maze, and that narcissism is not an effective barrier to the death drive. So getting back to the question of hedonism, instead we have a culture of hedonistic individualism, the unrestrained search for pleasure, which becomes indistinguishable from the death drive. There's the snag, shall we say, of contemporary hedonism. It's the return of the jouissance of hedonism in the form of the death drive. Driven by the imperative of the new superego, not just enjoy, but enjoy to the point of your own disappearance. There's a conclusion in this, if we got a moment for it, but just around that idea of the religion of overdose. So overdose is not an unfortunate accident. To some extent, it's almost like overdose at the center of the new religion, not just Purdue Pharmacy and OxyContin and fentanyl, which offers the subject, the market offers the subject ever increasing ways to exterminate themselves via higher doses of jouissance. But on the one hand, at stake in that is a paradoxical form of search for an other, the quest for a viable other, not just in which one could believe, but also that would impose some kind of limit to that push to jouissance. But to the point at which the search for the other becomes indistinguishable from the push to jouissance, where to some extent despair and satisfaction culminate in the same point of the extinction under the command of the superego. You can see when that plays itself out in the clinic, it's quite a tricky knot to negotiate. You will excuse me for garbling some of these, just trying to get some of the lines of force into. If we had more time, we could go back and work some of these questions more carefully. But through all of this argument, Laurent follows the path of the question of the constitution of contemporary subjectivity. So on the one hand, the question of the coordinates of contemporary civilization, the discourses of civilization, and on the other hand, the question of the coordinates of contemporary subjectivity in order to locate the point of articulation which would be the symptom. So this is where all of that is designed to sketch a new place for the symptom. Not just the array, shall we say, of contemporary symptoms thrown up by modifications in the discourses of civilization, but a more fundamental question of the central role of the symptom formulated by Laurent as follows: the search for a symptom that is worth believing in, which to some extent we could say is the central question of this text. It's also the point at which one version of the stakes of the psychoanalytic clinic intersects with the psychoanalytic reading of the stakes of contemporary discontents. The decline of the ideal as decline in the belief in the other, accompanied by an abandonment to the push to jouissance without limit. The demands of the superego, enjoy, enjoy, enjoy. In each case, subjects then abandoned to the search for a limiting principle that would both provide viable access to jouissance, but keep that jouissance within some kind of viable limits within the sphere of the living. So at this point, we can see where the symptom would come to occupy the place of the name of the father. So on the one hand, in the course of Lacan's work, we see the reduction of the father to a symptom, to one symptom amongst others. But at the same time, the converse one is to erect the symptom to the function of the name of the father, where the symptom would do what the name of the father previously did. It's glaringly obvious once you see it, but it's easy to get lost in the underbrush. So we could say that the culmination of the argument of this text is put in the following formulation. One ambition for the psychoanalysis of our times would be to pass from belief in the father to belief in the symptom. So, in a funny way, the stake of Lacan's, the trajectory of Lacan's work, in parallel with the trajectory of Freud, but via the critique of Freud, as seen in Seminar 17, reducing the name of the father to a symptom, but at the same time making the symptom the foundation of the support of some kind of livable other, and therefore the symptom as the basis for any kind of social bond and any kind of viable society. We'll leave it there, although one could go, there's a couple more steps that one could go around, but we might leave a bit of room to speak about these things, if you like.